Eric Schmidt needs no introduction, so I won't introduce him. Is that fair?
That's fine.
That's fair. I want to jump right in. There's going to be no jokes because this is very serious. Technology and democracy, very, very serious subject. First, before we get into the huge
you
stuff.
Must be leading up to a joke.
No, that's not actually leading up to a joke. I have a lot of jokes, but I'm not going to use any of them.
Look, if you're not going to use any jokes, then why are we here?
Okay, so these two Jewish cannibals are sitting in the woods around a stir pot, and the first Jewish cannibal says to the second Jewish cannibal, "God, I hate my mother-in-law." And the second Jewish cannibal says, "So just eat the noodles." Thank you. Do you want to just quit? You want to just quit now? So Eric Schmidt. Before we get to the sort of universal issues, let me ask you a quick thing, because there's rumors floating around the internet, and we know that most rumors on the internet are true.
I actually believe everything written in the internet is true.
Everything
word
written about you is true. Right?
Every single word in the internet is true, including all the things that disagree with each other.
That's a good, healthy policy to have. The internet is reporting that the New York Times wants you to run its business. Have you seen these?
I have seen those rumors.
Have you seen those rumors? Would you care to comment on those rumors?
No.
Would you like to run the New York Times?
No.
Would you want to reconsider that for a minute?
No.
Oh. Do you not like the New York Times?
I love the New York Times.
So why don't you want to run the New York Times?
Because I'm a subscriber. I like it that way. Mm-hmm. There are things that are worth renting and things that are worth owning.
That's good. You know why that's a good answer? Because it fits in a tweet. That answer will fit in a tweet.
And by the way, so we're clear, that was a joke. I've learned in the Twitter world, you have to actually precede and follow every joke by the word joke.
Joke.
And just so we're clear, since you're telling jokes. So one of my interviewers said, tell a joke. So I said, well, I think it's very clear that what's going to happen, I mean, with all of these people online, is that when you're 18, you're just going to have to change your name. But that wasn't me. I looked like that, but that really wasn't me. It was somebody else. So this was written up as an actual policy.
Really?
That was a joke.
That was a joke.
Yeah, it wasn't a very good joke.
But it's actually a good idea.
So then I had to spend the next 6 months.
It actually is a good idea.
And then I had to spend the next 6 months explaining that I was a bad joke teller.
Oh, all right.
So please continue.
Thank you. After you. All right, so let's put aside the New York Times for a minute. Let's just start with, the subject is democracy, the intersection of democracy and technology. Let's start with the obvious, which is we're a year and a half out from the Arab Spring. We've had a little time to digest the idea that Twitter and Facebook, the Google kids of Tahrir Square, were indispensable in making these revolutions happen. Now that you have some distance from it, how important was technology in making these things happen?
So I went to Libya and Tunisia shortly after all this happened and spent some time talking to the people. And the dictators that ran these countries had very complete censorship regimes. Your phones were tapped, the telephone stations were owned by the government, the press was controlled, but they didn't control the internet. And there had been protest movements, including violent ones, for years against the despotic regimes, the lack of opportunity, the corruption, and so forth, but they could never get organized. And so what the internet allowed is for people who were of the same mind to find each other and get organized and then do what revolutions do, which we saw successfully in those two. So one way to understand the Arab Spring Revolution is it was a failure to properly censor and prohibit communication by the internet. Unfortunately, Assad, now in Syria, has learned that lesson because he studied his previous dictators. And there are massive, massive attempts to control this, because if you can control the way in which people organize, you can prevent it.
Do you think, based on what you know, that these revolutions would not have happened without the ability to communicate in a way that the regime couldn't figure out?
What I was told, and I believe is true, is especially in Libya, you had initially 5 or so militias in one of the cities that was the most violent, and they were all basically trying to get themselves organized, and they didn't know when to strike. And the internet was the only way in which they could organize essentially an armed revolt. So the lesson to be learned is, if you're a dictator, don't allow that. And the good news is it's extremely difficult for dictators, especially those that are 80 years old, to understand this and implement it.
Let me ask you.
And by the way,
yeah.
the serious answer here is, when we talk about censorship and we talk about breaking up the internet, it's a slippery slope from, oh, we don't like this kind of speech or what have you, to the kind of thing I'm talking about. And in my view, it's very, very important that we understand that the internet built essentially with these open and transparent values, that this continue and this be a global phenomenon. There are very, very powerful forces that are trying to prevent these kinds of scenarios.
Let me ask you another question about another possible flaw in the notion. The internet revolutions are leaderless revolutions.
But again, I think it's completely unfair to the people who died in these revolutions to call it an internet revolution.
Well, let me
the internet,
revolutions aided by the internet.
All they did was use the internet to do things which were courageous and important, and people died from it. It's important not to take too much credit for their courage, and it's important to honor the dead who followed this. I would argue that there are two things about the revolutions. There were fewer people who died in these revolutions than there should have been. And a lot of that was because of the incessant media coverage of it, that the evil people on the other side did not shoot as many people, right? There was less loss of life, which is obviously a great thing. And the second thing is, it's very easy to start what you're calling an internet revolution, and it's very hard to finish it.
I want to come back to both of those points, especially the first one, which is interesting and contradicted a little bit by some of the other things we're seeing right now. But come back to this point. Revolutions aided by the internet, we'll call it that, are leaderless revolutions. It's a crowdsourced revolution, which is great for getting people into the square. The Google kids, rose to the top of this, but now we see that they've been completely in Egypt, which is the key country we're talking about. They're completely shunted aside and squashed. And one of the reasons is that a leader in the Valenza style, solidarity style, never emerged. Is there some way around that? Do you think of that as a serious flaw? I mean, I think you're a partisan of freedom, so you would obviously want these people to be able to organize. Is there some way of organizing a leader-led revolution through technology?
It's interesting that true leaders are very hard to find. It's very hard to find the equivalent of a de Gaulle or a George Washington or what have you, and somebody who can really unify the disparate interests of these countries. So in Libya, for example, you have now 80 militias, all of them armed to the teeth, who are largely unmanaged. So you're the potential president of this country. How are you going to organize that? In most of the Arab countries, there were repressed Muslim groups, the most popular one being Muslim Brotherhood. There's a group called NADA that does the same thing in Tunisia, that have emerged as an organizing force because they were organized while they were being in oppression. So the more likely scenario is that a group takes over for a while. And the great thing about democracy is that whatever group is in charge will inherit enormous financial and structural problems in these economies. And eventually, if they don't do a good job, they'll get thrown out and there'll be a new leader. And eventually, I think leaders will emerge that can take on the challenge, if it's a real democracy.
Right. You talk about the cluelessness of the Mubarak secret police, the cluelessness of the
They were thugs.
They were no, but technologically clueless in that.
They were technological thugs. They did not understand. I mean, if you're going to be a thug, be a sophisticated one, right? They weren't even that.
Right. That's also tweetable, by the way.
Yeah, and that was also a joke.
Yeah, and also a joke.
You can't win.
No, you can't win. Let's move to China, because China is an example much bigger than Syria of a repressive single-party system in which the government has the ability and the technological know-how to track people who are dissidents and to get them to stop communicating with each other. All of the things that didn't happen in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya that allowed these revolutions to happen. Maybe you could just broaden this out and talk about Google's tumultuous relationship with China. Obviously, in the last period, the company has made a decision, which is a little bit of a thumb in the eye of the Chinese government, to alert people using the search engine about words that might get them disconnected from the internet. It's a not unsubtle but not completely blunt way of communicating the idea that, hey, we know you guys are messing with the freedom of the internet.
It was a small number of seconds before the Chinese responded to our
Right.
latest provocation, if you will. China is very different from the Arab world. The Arab world, of course, has grown out of a tribal structure and is a different religious structure. China has been a sort of an organized hierarchical structure for on the order of 5,000 years. There's a lot of reasons to believe that China works because its citizens like the kind of structure. They like the kind of order that China now provides. And there's a lot of anthropological history that says that this might be true. So, you know, from my perspective, that means that dissidents don't have a voice, people are not empowered, and many of us, and certainly I believe, that you can't build a true knowledge society without true freedom of expression. And China, of course, wants that. So, as a long story, about 5 years ago...
China wants the knowledge society without the freedom.
But at some level, China, if you talk to their leaders, or more likely listen to them because they don't really listen to you, they really want to be at the global stage, and they want to have the kind of GDP that you have in the West, you know, $30,000 per capita, that kind of stuff. And it's unclear whether China's current model produces much more than a middle-income trap. It's a largely manufacturing society. The institutions that we take for granted, the universities, the rule of law, and so forth, are not fully implemented. There's a raging debate among experts as to whether China will overcome those strategies. So enter Google 5 years ago, and our theory was that if we put up with the censorship, which we did not like, we would empower the citizens, and the citizens would revolt if this stuff was taken away from them. And our experiment was wrong, and we're not perfect, and we make mistakes. And what happened was the censorship got worse and worse, and then about a year and a half ago, we pulled the plug, and we moved to Hong Kong. And so the joke that we told the Chinese was, you said it's one country, two systems, we like the other system. They didn't appreciate that either. And
they don't have like a great sense of humor about internet freedom?
Instead, they have something called the Great Firewall. And the Great Firewall is a computer system that's very sophisticated. It sits between us and the mainland part of China, including, and Hong Kong is on our side. And it does censorship and it throttles things down. So when we moved to Hong Kong, to spare you the technical details, we're on the other side of this firewall, so we can poke through it, we understand it, we can measure it.
You literally moved all the servers.
We did.
Yeah.
We had to by law, and we want to observe their law because we don't want to be put in jail in China for obvious reasons. And so one of the things that we did recently, which is the current cat and mouse game, is that when you enter a forbidden query in China, we will actually predict that it's likely to be blocked, which is driving them crazy.
And tell the user.
Yeah, and it's illegal for us under their law to announce what those keywords are, because that would they would be telling you the things that they don't want you to know. And it's illegal and I would not tell you what they are now because I don't want to endanger our employees. But you can imagine those queries are involving things like Falun Gong and the Chinese government and those sorts of things.
Is it a pretty wide basket of issues that they can't?
But they're very conservative. If you think about a government that is not elected, their number one goal is to stay elected, and the best way to stay elected is not to be embarrassed.
Well, let me frame an Arab Spring question in the Chinese context, which is, could what happened in Cairo? Is there any possible way that could happen? In other words, you know, I was in Cairo while some of this was going on, you know, and talked to people after and said, you know, they were literally tweeting, don't go down this street, they'll kill you there, go down this street. Facebook was obviously coordinating a lot of stuff. Is it possible, would be possible if Tiananmen Square, if young students decided they want to go occupy Tiananmen Square again, could they organize electronically? Could they organize digitally?
They would use a service called Weibo, which is the analog of Twitter in China, and it's possible using coded words and so forth they can do it. There have been a number of stories where people have tried to organize such events, and because the security police is so thorough, two people will show up for a demonstration, and then there'll be 30 reporters and 50 police. So they're not quite at the stage where this kind of stuff's going to happen.
Right. You know, it's interesting because
I should say that I don't. You know, you never want to say never. It's going to be a long time before that kind of stuff happens in China. The difference with Egypt was, remember that the more education you had in Egypt, the less likely you had a job. Right. It was actually a system that was run literally hierarchically the wrong way. It's unbelievable. And it had a lot to do with the way the military-industrial complex within Egypt worked, the way the ownership structures worked, the lack of innovation in their industries and so forth. And in fact, the country largely has run out of its financial reserves. It's quite a very serious issue now for the new government.
Your company has always been at the forefront of arguing that greater democratization of information, greater communication would inevitably erode authoritarian control of societies. Are you more sober-minded about that now than you were? I mean, I could borrow from our mutual friend, my colleague Jim Fallows, who says that the mantra is, you know, the arc of internet freedom is long, but it bends toward justice. I mean, are you a little bit more cautious about that than you guys used to be?
The biggest thing I've learned in doing this is how hard it is to deal with the reality of people's lives in countries. We take for granted a uniform, homogeneous sort of culture in America. We speak the same language. We have pretty much common values. The differences, political differences, which seem very magnified to us, are actually relatively minor compared to the kinds of things that go on in other countries where you have huge tribal difference, huge racial difference, huge histories and the legacies of wars, religious conflicts, and so forth and so on. I continue to believe, and I believe very profoundly, that this device will change the world. And it goes something like this. The way you're going to solve most of the world's problems is by educating people. And education means understanding things, learning how to be curious, learning how to read, all of that. Because in our lifetimes, these devices will become ubiquitous to, 7 of the 8 billion people that will be around. There's 7 billion now. It'll be possible to actually to see how far we can get. We've never had a tool that could educate people with respect to the choices they have. And in terms of the threats we face as America, but also more importantly, the injustices that go on in the world, these things can serve as your best protection. You can know what your choices are. If something bad happens to you, you can publicize it, and you can ask for justice. And in the worst case, you can actually shame people.
But let me ask you. And now, we know that Google, and to a greater extent Facebook, they like to collect data about people and data about what people are doing and where they are. You've spoken about that. That's somewhat benign. I'm more scared of Google than I used to be, but it's still a somewhat. We'll go into that. But it's in an open society. That's a relatively benign phenomenon. But that device in the hands of a Chinese person who wants to change something about his government can also be used to track that person. The government can use that the opposite direction. So how is that? That seems to pose some dangers.
But let's go back to the basic idea, which is if you educate people and you get them to understand they have choices, they will eventually organize to make things better in whatever culture and context they want, especially in the area of things like women and women's rights, which matter a great deal for the developing world. With the question of surveillance, these devices tend to grab information. They tend to be recording just by their nature. Your phone, everybody here has a phone on them. That means the phone company knows exactly where you're sitting right now. You're not worried about it because there's a law that says the phone company can't come and harass you for your unpaid bill while you're sitting there. Right? There are all sorts of reasons why that kind of information is properly regulated around your privacy, rule of law, and those kinds of things. There's a possibility that in these countries, as these devices become commonplace, that the kind of obvious things about privacy and so forth that we all take for granted will be lost. Put another way, if in a culture where there is not an agreement upon basic rights, basic principles, basic human rights, you could imagine the government always going to taking away your rights, always surveilling you, and so forth. And that's much toward the surveillance state kind of model that we hate.
Right. Let me turn to America for a minute and ask you this very basic question. Is there any evidence that our democracy is better off for having the internet?
I don't think when we built the internet, we didn't think that was the problem we were solving. And I think most people would agree that more speech is better. The clear outcome of the current situation is that more speech means constant polling, there's a lack of deliberative time, if you will, in our political process. And our political leaders will eventually figure out that they're going to make better decisions if they actually take a break and spend a week thinking. Which
How is that even possible?
Well, they actually are elected and they can actually talk to each other.
And you have that much faith in the
Yes,
American college?
I do.
Wow.
Things will get bad enough that eventually reason will prevail. No, and
I'm not speechless that often, but it doesn't
and-
seem like we're heading in that trajectory. The trajectory doesn't seem to be moving
No,
in
but
the,
see,
in the
but
direction
I-
of thoughtfulness.
Well, it's these problems will get themselves resolved. If you look at in America today, we spend all of our time complaining about our democracy, but in fact, compared to many, many countries, we're doing really quite well. If you look at GDP growth, if you look at the nature of our private sector, our entrepreneurship, 18 of the 20 top research universities in the world are here in the United States. The United States is literally the beacon of innovation. I love to talk about my industry, but let's talk about energy, right? In the next decade, not only are we going to have extraordinarily good outcomes from natural gas, there are huge new finds of oil here in America due to new technology. The rate of innovation and discovery around energy is as fast, if not faster, than what I do. This is an American success story. Let's celebrate that for a change.
No, that's all fine, but when everything is working, but your politics are dysfunctional, you seem to have a serious. The reason
By the way,
yeah.
somebody elected these people.
Who?
There were as far as I can tell, there were actually votes in every district that elected these people.
That's fine. No, but
Every
but
single one of the
maybe
4
the
to
problem
35.
is the system,
And the president
the
and
systems, not the individuals. Well, here I'll give you an example. I just want to push on this point for a minute. And obviously the velocity of.
Can I say,
You want to tell a joke?
no. I have a saying. Okay, if you get a dollar bill out and you look on the back, it's going to say, "In God we trust." So let's all say that. In God we trust. All others have to bring data. Okay? So if we could just have a simple rule, right? Just every one of the politicians and they're all guilty. Just start with some facts. Right? Then we'll have a conversation.
But let me ask you about facts, and let me just keep pushing on this for a second, because obviously the velocity of good information has increased.
Yeah.
We understand that, but I think of it this way. 15 years ago, the birthers and the 9/11 truthers were the equivalent of those people. Were guys standing outside the IRS office with newspaper stuff down their pants, screaming about the Trilateral Commission. And you would walk by them, they would hand you some 6-page single-space type craziness, and you would throw it away. Now
I love that stuff.
they have. Well, I collected it too, but now they're on the web. So in other words,
no. You don't understand. Basically, 0.5% of Americans is actually crazy, and they live in their basement. And
they
mom,
have blogs.
no. Mom has been feeding them food in the basement for years. 2 years ago, mom got them a broadband connection.
I know. And that broadband connection has increased the velocity.
And they have a lot of free time.
I know. Well, if you could just use your analytics to find them and take away their computers, we'd be better off.
By the way, we're not going to do that.
I understand.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to rank them. And we're going to say you're in the bottom 1/2 of 1% of people we want to hear from.
Let me ask you.
I mean, Google is in the ranking business. We should be able, the serious answer to this is we should be able to have all of these voices, which we want to hear, including the crazy people, and we should be able to figure it out. We should actually be able to do a sort. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing a good enough job.
Well, let me ask you about a Google search I did this morning. And this is not in the same category as birthers and truthers, obviously, but I plugged in the words Syria massacre, because I wanted to read everything I could possibly read about what happened in Syria overnight. 200 people were slaughtered by the government. So I plug in Syria massacre, and the first story that comes up is a story from Russia Today, the RT website, which, and the headline was something like, Syrian government says opposition behind massacre. Okay, now I'm a reasonably discerning Google user. I'm a reporter who writes a lot about the Middle East, so I went down 5, 6, 7, 8 stories. They all look authoritative because they all come on the Google search, and so the question is, I guess the question is, how fast can you organize that so that the web is reflecting and the search is reflecting not just the popularity and not just the velocity of links, but you know what? We here at Google are going to edit the web a little bit for you and say that, you know, our New York Times is probably a better source for information than Russia Today, which is a Putin-controlled.
I would actually argue that you're probably better off hearing multiple viewpoints, and that Russia Today is a pretty good proxy for the alternative view on what's going on in Syria, and you as a reporter want to see both.
There aren't alternative facts, though. Views are fine, but they're presenting a set of alternative reality
facts. Unfortunately, we're not in charge of their level of accuracy, which we know is low, but we can give you that choice, and that's one of the great things about the internet and America and so forth, that you can discuss it and you can think about it. I go back to my basic message, which is that this next generation of people have to learn in school, and all of us have to learn. And I was joking, obviously, that I believed everything, every literal word of the internet was all true, that not everything that's written down is true. We grew up, all of us grew up, with an assumption that what we were seeing on television, especially in the legitimate news and so forth and so on, was edited and properly vetted. That's no longer the case. And furthermore, you can anticipate very powerful forces will attempt to do misinformation campaigns to you for one business objective or another. That it will be worth them to spend millions of dollars to create fake websites and so forth in order to convince you that something that's really bad for you is really good for you, because they have a business interest to do so. And the internet allows that. We have to rank against it, but you all have to be also aware that searching doesn't mean that you have to believe it. You have to do your own investigation.
I want to come to the future soon, but I want to stay for a moment in the present and on the company. Google, for whatever reason, has entered a phase. I wouldn't say it's as bad in terms of PR as Microsoft went through a few years ago, but you're big enough, you're ambitious enough that you've run into problems, European regulators, on whether you're loading the searches, the Street View issue. And this is a democracy question, the privacy question. Those of you who don't know, there was a controversy in which the people doing the Google Street View photographs of your front doors were collecting unencrypted information from your Wi-Fi, from your wireless systems, and you've gotten into some trouble for that. And I'm wondering if you could talk about privacy and Google. Maybe privacy is antithetical to the very idea of what you do, but talk about some of those controversies and talk about privacy.
Well, first place, I'm very concerned that the sum of everything we're talking is reducing the amount of privacy that all of us have. In some cases, it's self-inflicted. There is no delete button on the internet, and so if you, as a young person, put a picture of your friend who's 16 years old, drunk, throwing up and so forth on the internet, you may be ruining her life, and there's a couple of cases of that. So we all have, and humans are not going to mature enough, fast enough, especially with kids, to do that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around respecting that. If you think about it, when you begin life, you have a complete private identity as a baby, and that as you grow older, especially since you can't delete anything, your ability to control your own identity as a percentage declines, right? That more and more people ascribe things to you, you have more life experiences, and I think we're going to have to adapt to that. So with respect to the questions of, I'm not sure how to phrase the question, the Wi-Fi thing that you mentioned was an error. It was a violation of our policy. We noticed it, we announced it, we took the data to the investigators, and it's been thoroughly investigated, and it was a mistake, and we apologize for that. And hopefully that's not going to happen again. It's certainly not going to happen in that way again. But I think this technology, all of us should be careful to understand what this means for the very important right of personal privacy.
We're going to go to questions in a few minutes, but I wanted to come to one more thing before we talk about what's coming in the future, and that's the future of journalism and Google's role in either saving or destroying journalism. Aggregation is not the same thing as original reporting, and obviously this is a parochial concern. Somebody on the Atlantic said to me today, ask him if he thinks there's still a purpose for a monthly magazine. So I'll ask you that, and then we'll come to...
What I particularly like about the question about the Atlantic is actually making money and growing in popularity. So good judgment, good leadership, excellent reporting.
Keep going. Oh, that's great.
So what we're seeing now is we're seeing a number of institutions, of which the Atlantic is one of a number, that are figuring it out. Let me point out to Politico, very successful, largely online, but has a print component. The Huffington Post, also very successful, has a print component, does not have a print component, all monetizing in different ways. So clever entrepreneurs are figuring out a way to make money in this new model. So a reasonable model going forward is that the traditional incumbents have been reduced, if you will, in scale, but there are plenty of new voices. So what should we worry about those voices? And by the way, if you take a look, we just announced a tablet, which includes the ability to have dynamic magazines, where the magazines are not just static, but actually on a page, you can go deep in it, and it is interactive in various clever ways. If you, again, think about it over a 5 or 10 year period, most people here will probably be reading this sort of media on tablets, because the tablets will get better and better and better and better and faster and so forth, and there'll be new monetization sources. So what to really worry about? And I think what you really want to worry about is that there was kind of an interesting bargain that we grew up with, which is that the newspapers had enough cash flow from classifieds and subscriptions and so forth that they could fund long-term investigative research. It's much harder to do that now. And I think that there's a loss to democracy of losing that. And there are a number of people, ProPublica was formed, a number of other people who've tried to address this. I don't think it's fully solved, and I think it's important.
Do you think Google has a role to solve it?
We have debated how to do it. The problem is we don't want to cross the content line.
Why not?
Because if we crossed the content line and we started to own companies like The Atlantic, we would always be accused of bias in our rankings, our own versus somebody else's. And plus, content, as you know, is very difficult, and we're not necessarily good at that. So by focusing on being a very, very good search engine, ranking system, presentation engine, monetization engine, which is what we try to do.
I just want to make this. I just want to clarify this because it's such an important point. Do you think that in the and again, this is it's a little bit of a parochial concern, but I think it's a concern about democracy as well. Do you think that in the coming years, the searches will be searching essentially for accuracy rather than popularity?
Well, today,
and both of those, and it doesn't mean one. You can't be both.
No, but Google's algorithms are not at a core about popularity. They're at about a link structure. They're about a structure of information. We start from well-known sites and we rank using a complex formula that's proprietary. So I think we're already there. And so if we're not ranking right, it's because our algorithms need to get better. We're not done yet.
Okay. Let's go to two other subjects before we open this up. One is about the world of technology. The other is about you. Which one do you want to do first?
Your choice.
Oh, thank you. Let's do technology. Can you just, because I think everybody who's on devices all the time, everybody's on tablets, everybody's on the internet. What does it look like? What does the technology landscape look like 5 years from now?
We're governed by something called Moore's Law, and Moore's Law is, roughly speaking, the doubling of transistor density every 2 years. So every device that you have should either fall in price by a half or double in performance by a factor of 2 every 2 years. So if you sort of do the math, you'll discover that that's a rate of a factor of 10 every 5 years and those sorts of things. So it's very, very fast. We forget how poor quality the mobile phones were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. We forget how bad the initial iPod was versus what it is today. We forget how slow the PCs and Macs were versus what they have today because we've sort of grown up with it. So this improvement in performance, and by the way, it's accelerating, it's faster than Moore's Law for disks and fiber optics, means a continuing explosion in connectivity, bandwidth, and so forth. Google is busy wiring up Kansas City as a test with gigabit fiber. On a gigabit fiber, you can take every piece of content that you can consume and put it on in perfect HD quality. All the distinctions between television and radio and DVDs and so forth all go away. It's just bits coming in on a pipe. That's all technically possible now.
So give us a little bit more sense of what the devices themselves will be.
Well, we don't know. It's clear that the sort of iPhone-led device is going to be, there'll be billions of those. iPhone, Android, that sort of design center. There'll be different sizes. There'll be tablets of many different sizes. We introduced this week an Android device that's a sort of a video music controller that's controlled over the cloud. So we anticipate a lot of specialty devices. One way to think about it is that the PC industry defined a platform that was locked to the PC, But this new set of players and new set of startups are taking software and hardware and combining it into all these new consumer devices, which are hard to predict.
I need to return to one point before we talk about your future, which is, and it's a democracy point again, which is you're predicting ever-increasing speed of information. And this is really eating at me. How do you expect an ordinary politician, a competent person who wants to serve, in this environment of instantaneous, overwhelming information, to actually say, you know what, I'm not going to comment on that for a week until I think about it and I go into a cabin in the woods and really cogitate on this. And the question is that very basic question of, you know, are we inventing devices, are we inventing a technology that is past our ability, that has moved so far past our ability to process information?
A lot of people basically said that all this technology would cause people to lose human contact. But in fact, the evidence is that people have more and more human contact just in new ways. So I think human behavior is pretty much the same, but the technology allows it to be expressed in these much more rapid ways. I would say overall, it's better to know everything and then elect leaders who have judgment. And that we have to come up with some way of sorting that. I would start with asking them to operate from a basis of facts.
In politics, you are helping President Obama, the digital strategy. Talk about your own future, if you will. You ever want to run for office?
No, I actually decided I didn't want to. That's a line I did not want to cross. It's much more fun to know them than to be them. Trust me. And so I think it's for me personally, I've decided to spend my time working on these questions that you're asking about, which I don't think we necessarily know the answer. But information is power, and the reason people are so interested in this area is that with this explosion in information, new groups of people can get power, new opportunities are enabled, there are new opportunities for innovation, and I think it's almost all positive.
Why are you supporting Obama?
I supported him in 2008, and I like having a very, very smart president.
Do you think that Romney is not smart?
No, I didn't say that.
I know. Well, I'm just asking a leading question.
I know Mitt Romney actually pretty well, and he's a very, very good man. I think if you look at my personal view, which is just my own opinion, is I tend to prefer the policies that Obama has put in place, and I believe that they can be improved. But I think ultimately that produces a better and more civil society.
Can you give us any insight based on your work there? What policies might look like, and could you give us maybe a brief sense of what the Obama campaign's digital strategy is going to be? I assume it's working mainly on.
I think I'd rather not. Let's see. The goal of the campaign is to win.
Fair enough. I can't argue. I could try to argue with everything, but I can't argue with that. We're going to go to questions, and there are mic runners there and there. Why don't you go right there, just for convenience sake? Could you just stand up?
Sure. Hi, my name's Ellen. You specifically said that Google wasn't created to solve the problem of democracy. What was the problem you were trying to solve?
Well, Google was founded by our two founders to give you access to all the world's information. And so we're very, very focused on end users and how we get information to them very fast. We have a very strong belief that users given lots of information will make the right choices.
Fair enough. Right there. Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Now there it is.
Yeah.
John Debs, Palo Alto. Thanks for a great discussion here. My question, Eric, is we're really in the third world here in terms of our connectivity versus going to even a sinking place like Europe, certainly Korea, countries like that. I'm interested, since you're advising and so on, why haven't we been able to upgrade our connectivity?
It's a complicated question. Europe, by the way, over-provisioned their networks because of various reasons, and they paid for it economically. Virtually all of the wireless networks under 3G and 4G are running out of bandwidth. All of the internal predictions say that with the rate at which people are buying iPhones, Androids, tablets, and so forth, that these networks are saturated in 2016. And various people, you can debate whether it's 2016 or 2017, but it's very soon. And makes sense, right? Because you were just typing little text messages, and now you're surfing, running applications, watching movies, and so forth. The industry is trying various solutions involving bandwidth allocation, bandwidth caps, bandwidth pricing. There's a much better solution, and there's a report that's being released in a few weeks by the White House. I'm on the committee that did this, which says that the technology has moved to the point where we can share the bandwidth to have not infinite bandwidth, but almost infinite bandwidth. And the way this is done is that today when you allocate frequencies, they're allocated around a whole chunk, and most of it's unused. Whereas if you follow the reasoning, we would share the same bandwidth here and then say in Grand Junction, and yet the sharing could be quite different there because the signal doesn't fire that way. And using various techniques involving interference and databases, which are now well understood, we think we can solve this problem. It remains to be seen whether that'll get fixed or not.
Do we have a mic in there? Yeah, thank you, yes.
Kathy Madden from New York City. I have a question. I hope I'm not naive in asking this, and you probably haven't asked it before, but how do you relate the sense of community and communication that, and democracy, I guess, that technology gives one and communities, and the sense of community and democracy in a real place, a physical place where people go to the town square or socialize or meet each other, gather?
So what you're seeing is the creation of new digital sort of watering holes. People spend a great deal of time in communities that are virtual, that did not exist before. And they're doing much the same thing. They're chatting, exchanging, developing friendships, developing virtual relationships that ultimately might lead to physical business or personal relationships. So again, but from a human's perspective, as long as they're happy, that's a pretty good outcome. And we see, for example, with the diasporas of people who have left countries, now they can stay connected to their country in a way they couldn't before. So to the degree that the limitations of time and place are being removed, I think it makes society in many ways closer. I don't think that you should avoid spending time in the real world. I think you should recognize that you should use the virtual world to make your real world experience bigger, more interesting, more fun, more meaningful to you. And a typical example is family members now that are always on Skype, right? So the grandmother looking at the grandbaby on Skype. And those are priceless moments, and they're just as valuable when they're on Skype as they would be in the real world.
Before we go to another question, there's something that you said that I wanted to come back to that I forgot to, which is you talk about the power of shame, that you can use technology, use the internet, use YouTube to shame governments that are committing persecution, committing sort of, but there seem to be some counter examples of that right now. There are certainly plenty of videos up on the web, on YouTube, from Syria of horrible things. He doesn't seem to be being shamed into exile.
There's always a really evil person, right? But that doesn't mean the other 7 billion are evil. I mean, that is a particularly brutal dictatorship that's willing to take their guns and turn them on their own citizens and assassinate them, right? Not good. The fact of the matter is that's the exception. Most governments, even autocratic governments, do care about being embarrassed. China had a railway incident, and the railway stuff is not on the censorship list. And so there was huge embarrassment about how the railways weren't running, and so the railways got safer. So it can work.
Right. I saw somebody, all the way over there. Is it possible to get the...
Thank you. Jonathan Halpern with Designing Sustainability. I wanted to come back to a phrase that you used when you said, by their nature, and then phones sort of collect information and want to know where you are and stuff. And in the context of sort of democracy and technology, where in a democracy, responsibility is a key component in addition to independence and freedom, that strikes me as an avoidance or a dismissal of sort of organizational responsibility where phones, I'm not sure they collect by their nature. They are programmed, they have software, even if it's machine-created software. Someone created the program to create the software. So can you talk a little bit about what you meant by their nature?
So perhaps that was a poor use of language. What I meant was in order to do their work, they collect this information. what we allow done with that information is entirely a legal, cultural, business question. Much of that stuff is starting to get regulated, and I think it's properly regulated. But the phones have to know where they are because they have GPS signals, they have to provide E911 services and so forth. But that information obviously should not be misused.
I saw somebody, maybe I didn't see somebody over there. There's somebody over there, though. Yeah, there's a hand right there. And there's a hand over there, too. Everybody has hands. But that hand is up. Can you get it?
Yes, by the way, everyone has 2 hands.
Everyone, hands. I said hands, plural. There's a lot of hands.
Hi. Eric, I think everybody agreed on the example of Syria and Russia that having all information out there and having the newspaper story, as incorrect as it was a good idea.
Yeah.
But you seem to believe, well, I'll ask you, do you believe that, let's use American citizens as an example, are we inherently critical thinkers? Is it your belief that if we have all this information, that in some way we'll be able to discern what's correct and what's incorrect? Because isn't the opposite actually possible unless we teach critical thinking?
I agree with the conclusion from your question that you stated already. There's a lot of evidence in psychology that we are born, again, without socialization, largely in a mode of immediate reaction to fight, animals and keep ourselves alive and all that kind of stuff. And that our brains can be taught reasoning, critical thinking, and so forth, but it requires a strong family, a strong culture, and a strong commitment to education. I do believe it has to be taught. The point is, what I always like to say is, why do you know that? And I love to read all these sort of long, long statements of fact, no citations, no backups, no way for me to figure out if the statements are really true or false. Right? So we should all be wary of that. These are appeals to our emotion without fact.
I think we have time for one more or 2 more. I'm not sure. But there was that person right there next to the mic. Yeah.
Eric, this question's for you. Given the massive amount of PII, personally identifiable information that Google collects, and I have nothing but admiration for what you and Sergey and Larry have done, is there a place for a Bill of Rights that simplifies the legalese that you put sort of on your privacy collection procedures and that could say in a more simple way to consumers, hey, this is the limits that we're going to play by. And so instead of having to read 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 words, and we know we're not going to read those, here's the 5 or 10 or 20 things we're not going to do.
I agree with that question. It's a fight between sort of the reasonable point of view that you have and the way the lawyers and the government who regulate the way we say these things come out. And unfortunately, it comes out as somewhat of a confusing morass, I think, and that's a good criticism. But let me reassure you the following. If you follow the goal that Google has, which is to have you as our customer, because we're all end-user focused, what's the quickest way to lose you as a customer? Violate your privacy, take your information and misuse it, use it for something that you did not intend us to, make you disgusted with us. And we are literally 1 click away from you using a set of competitors in each of these markets. And those competitors are well-funded, they're well-run, they have smart people. Right? So we operate every day with that as a check and balance. So even if you decide that we've invented some evil room and we've all gone into it and we've behaved this way, I can assure you that the natural interests of the company, which are end-user focused, would prevent us from that terrible outcome.
Yes, ma'am, over here.
So I'm Madalina, I come from Romania. Congratulations for what you're doing in Romania.
Yes.
My question is as following. Considering that there is such a rapid development of technology, can you imagine a world in which we no longer need representatives in order to deliberate and in order to actually take decisions, and actually citizens will be able, and if so, how many years?
I wish I could agree with you, but unfortunately I think I don't agree with you. I think that what will happen is it will become even more important to have democratic processes that bring people who can really lead countries and institutions forward. And the reason is it's getting more complicated. There's so many choices, so many. So if we were to adopt a model which was much more of a direct democratic model, we would spend all day, every day, rather than doing our normal jobs and our normal passions, trying to understand, trying to cut through the clutter, trying to make an important decision. It's not a good use of our time, and it also I don't think would produce as good an outcome as electing leaders who are great leaders, leaders who care about their countries, want to bring prosperity, care about the human beings, they're not corrupt, all those kinds of things.
Could I just do one slightly unorthodox thing? And I see my friend David Brooks pulling his chin back there. And I wanted to ask him if he could comment on something that Eric said, or a couple of things that Eric said, which really intrigued me, maybe because I don't actually believe them. No, you're staying right there. The hot dog stand is closed. We're finished. You have to stay here. You're here. The question I had is, I'm sitting next to, I think, an enormous optimist. He believes that despite the acceleration of information and the proliferation of websites.
But before you do that, the evidence is on my side.
Well, fine.
We're still here.
Well, I'm checking the evidence.
We're here after
against
World
Mr.
War I,
Evidence.
World War II.
No, we're here. I get it. But I just want to.
I'm trying to stack the question.
I'm not attacking you by calling you an optimist, even though I'm a pessimist.
The truth finally comes out.
No, it's fine, whatever. But the question is are you as sanguine as he is that our politicians will learn to slow their thinking down and their reacting time down and make more responsible decisions? And and how sure are you that Americans, educated Americans and otherwise, have the critical skills necessary to disaggregate, when they do a Google search, the crap from the real?
I'll start with the good news and then the bad news. It's not Google's job to figure out what's most true. There are many aggregator sites that do that for us. One of them is called the New York Times, by the way.
Is that a going concern?
But I go to a website called The Browser every morning, which is a British site which gathers together some of the best and most thoughtful pieces. I look at various bloggers. I look at a blog called Marginal Revolution a couple times a day. And these are very smart people who pick out things that are reliable. And that's not Google's job. That's the job of experts who you trust. So I think the web there's been I don't know, 3 years ago I thought I was in the whaling business. We were just dying. But I do think there's been a flight to quality over the last few years as people seek things that seem they know what they're talking about. The places I'm less sanguine, one, attention span. As you so rudely called on me, I was multitasking, checking my Twitter feed. Many people are tweeting this session, by the way. And so I do think that's bad. I find my own attention span is much worse. And as a result, the quality of my thinking is much worse than when I just had books. And second, I'm a little less sanguine about confirmation bias. That people will pick out the sites that tell them how right they are all the time. Yeah. And one of the reasons we do hive into tribes is because of that confirmation bias, and the web makes that so much easier.
Any comment?
I generally agree with David. I think, and David's in fact written a book on this particular subject. There's evidence in human psychology that we tend to, the first thing we hear we view as true, and then we judge plus and minus against that. That's why you're seeing this sort of cavalcade of the first story and so forth. And I think the answer to me is always at the end, culture, education, society, saying, does this really make sense? And I do also agree, and I want to make it clear, that the flight to quality will certainly benefit the leading newspapers, especially the New York Times.
I think we have a last question over here. Oh, we'll make it two quick questions, this
Garen?
and there.
Go ahead.
No, I promised this man over here. I promised him non-verbally, but I still promised him.
Go ahead, Garen.
Garen Stagel, Mind for Research. We're on the verge of the digitization of patient records across broad populations, which could accelerate our ability in research modes and other things, in drug discovery and otherwise. At the same time, we have very significant restrictions on HIPAA and other things in the use of it. Is there a way for patients to take control of their data and use it for their own benefit through trusted sources and other ways?
It's a very good question. There's an explosion in medical research that would indicate that you could take the equivalent of a USB stick of your own genetics and history and plug it in and get the actual prescription for you. And that would probably be not subject to the way the HIPAA rules work. The issue that's happening is that all of this medical world is moving to the cloud. And so if it's in the cloud and it's all out there, it's all subject to the HIPAA rules, and then there's all sorts of complications. So I don't know if it'll be done with HIPAA or not.
And the last question over
Yes,
here,
sir.
Richard Straub, Peter Drucker Society Europe. You started your presentation or your talk with education, with the importance of education. Now, technology, of course, has played or plays an important role in this field, but I would say the last 15 years were also a disappointment in this field. We didn't achieve what we thought we would achieve with technology in education. Do you see, from your perspective, a breakthrough coming?
Okay.
And what is it? And what would be Google's contribution to this breakthrough?
That's a very good question. One of the core problems in education is that the world that we are all talking about has changed so dramatically. We've been talking about it for an hour. But education has changed very little, changes very slowly. There are many reasons why it doesn't change quickly. Sometimes education, it seems to me, is run for the benefit of the teachers and not the students. It seems to me that education as a group has never taken a discipline around A/B testing. Prove that your approach is better than mine. It's all heuristics and analytics. There's a whole movement now to do measurable outcomes. I'm on the board of something called the Khan Academy, which is beginning to see statistically significant improvements in math education. There's physics research in universities that physics can be taught differently, where you have a 10-minute segment and then you do a collaborative work problem rather than having a lecture. You have another 10 minutes and then you do a collaborative work problem. And there's statistical evidence that that produces better learning. So we're beginning to apply the data rule to education. It just takes a very long time. My personal view on education is that we should just try everything. Try every approach, try to be open to everyone, don't have a bias, and measure it. Because we care, it's huge. And Google obviously wants to help.
Eric, thank you very much. That was great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.